and welcome to another episode of Curiosities in Psychology. So today we're going to be discussing the psychology of language, and I'm grateful to be joined today by Nenagh Kemp. So Nenagh is a lecturer and associate professor at the University of Tasmania, and she's specialising in the psychology of language. So thank you so much for being here today, Nenagh. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
So I want to start just by broadly asking, what is it that initially inspired you to pursue a career in language psychology?
I think it's something I've been interested in since I was a child. I remember when I was about 7, I discovered what homonyms or homophones were and was so interested that words that were spelt differently could be pronounced the same, like road and road.
Yeah.
And I just remember going to some barbecue with my dad and asking adults to help contribute to my list of homonyms. They must have thought I was very strange, but I remember how fascinated I was by that. And so I've always been interested in language and words. And then as an undergraduate, I did French and Italian and also psychology and zoology, and I just didn't know how to integrate these things. And then I finally discovered you could study the psychology of language from a scientific point of view. So I've been doing that ever since. So my honours was in children's reading development, my PhD's in children's spelling development, and now I'm still interested in that, but also language more generally.
Yeah, nice. Yeah, I remember reading that you did quite a bit with children as well.
Yeah.
And I love chatting to kids because it's so interesting hearing how they kind of explain things when they learn new words or learn different parts of a language. And it's hilarious sometimes, some of the things that they say, but it's also kind of mind-opening because they use it in such a creative way. So how does language in general kind of affect our perception of the world around us, and how does it shape our thoughts and beliefs and our way of processing the world?
So if you think about how language shapes our views on the world, you can't think very much without language. If you think about a baby who hasn't got language yet, or an animal that you might have that's very smart but doesn't have language, they can only think about the here and now. You can only say to your baby, like, do you want this or this, or anything that's within their sight and within their current environment. Whereas as soon as you have language, you can refer to things that are separated in space and in time. So you can talk about what you did last week, what you're going to do next year, what's on the other side of the world. And if you think about a creature without language, like your dog or your 1-year-old, or even a 1-year-old has some, but say a 1-year-old, you can't say next week we're doing such and such. You can't say to your dog, last week did you like that biscuit? So having language is what makes us human. It's what makes us able to plan for the future, learn from the past sometimes, and progress more than perhaps other species.
Yeah, for sure. And what about the differences kind of in like shaping our cultures and our social identity? Because I know that I was thinking the other night when I was thinking about doing this podcast, a few years ago, I went to Scotland with my family, and we did a little tour of the Hebrides Islands, so kind of west coast of Scotland. And the tour guide was chatting about the language that kind of used to be spoken there, Gaelic. I think that's how you pronounce it. I think there's like 4 different variations. And she was saying that in that language there's 50 different words for love. And I thought that's really cute, but it's interesting because we only have one word for it. And it just made me think about kind of the different like perceptions then of relationships, or of like stages of relationships that they might have that we don't really think about, or we don't acknowledge as much because we don't have the words for that. So yeah, what's your understanding or perspective on how language shapes our cultural identities?
Yeah, that idea of linguistic relativity is a really common one to think about in terms of language. So it was first developed, it's also called the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. So this idea that the way you label the world shapes how you see it. And a really strong version of that is it determines how you see the word. Like linguistic determinism means if you don't have a word separately for blue and green in your language, like in Japanese, I think the words for blue and green, you can sometimes use the same word. It doesn't mean that people who speak Japanese can't tell the difference. So most people would probably deny the idea of it being a definite determiner of how we see the world. But I think most people would also agree it does affect how we see the world. And there's a very classic one about the Inuit people of Alaska, or the northern regions of the world having this many words for snow because they live with snow a lot and so they need more words for it. Or the people of the Philippines, a traditional group of people who have a lot of different words for different stages of rice because rice is very important. So obviously if your environment values something in all its different forms, you'll have more words for it, but it doesn't mean that others can't understand those things. So it probably affects how you see the world a little bit, but not entirely.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, interesting. That reminded me as well of, I read this book a few years ago called The Happiness Dictionary by Tim Lomas, and he had kind of gone around to different cultures and collected kind of all these words that we didn't necessarily have in English, or he kind of translated them to English, and a lot of them were from Scandi countries, and a lot of them were around kind of happiness and coziness and those kinds of words. And it's funny because those cultures are kind of often thought to be the happiest cultures, and they have lots of words around happiness and things. So yeah, it's true what you said. It doesn't entirely affect our whole perspective, but it does kind of make us kind of think more about it if we have more words for it.
And if we don't have a word for it, sometimes we take it on. And there's a Scandinavian, I can't remember which language word, and I also can't remember the word itself, but I know it was very popular about 10 years ago. It's something like smigger, but I'm not sure if that's it. And it means coziness or
like
comfort.
Hygge?
Maybe it was that. I'm sorry, I can't actually remember. But a word that we took on, and also the obvious Schadenfreude, like delight in someone else's suffering. We didn't have a word for that. So we said, German's got it, let's have that. Yeah. So I think sometimes when a word feels a niche, we think, let's have that word, even if we don't have it.
Yeah, definitely. Let's move on to chat a little bit about being bilingual. So how does that kind of affect our brain and our cognitive abilities, and perhaps even our mental health as well?
Yeah, in Australia, in many parts of Australia, most of us are monolingual, and we think it's a bit exotic or unusual to be bilingual or multilingual, but in fact, worldwide, it's the majority of people speak more than one language, and we're in the minority if we only speak one. And so it's important to remember that more people than not are in this position. And speaking more than one language is actually good for your brain and good for everything. It lets you be aware that there's more than one way to say something, both in the very specific sense and in the more general sense of being more open to ideas. So there's various pieces of research that suggest that, so kids who only know one word for something, as I don't know about you, did you grow up monolingual?
Yeah.
So we would have thought that the word cat refers to a cat and that's it. Whereas if you're growing up learning French, you're perfectly happy to know that can mean chat or cat or whatever, or gâteau or cat or gâteau or whatever. And just in that small difference that you're aware that you can have two names and it's the same thing, and that's okay. Excuse me. You're actually more willing to take on different viewpoints. It affects the whole way you see the world. And also there might be different ways of saying things in different languages. And so you might be able to take on different points of view more easily because you're used to saying, and I don't just mean different literal words for things, but different ways you might say something. Like in some Romance languages, it's different how you'd say something about motion. So we might say he ran down the street, but in some Romance languages it might be like he went down the street running. And just the different ways of saying things in terms of expression make you more willing to think about different ways the world can be. So it does like open your mind in the broadest sense.
Yeah, definitely. And I think I guess what you're kind of getting to as well is that I read somewhere that it also makes you kind of more creative because you are, having a more open perspective. Yeah, cool. Let's move on to chat about digital communication, which is sort of more your area. So how has digital communication, such as like social media and texting, changed the way that we communicate with each other?
Yeah, it's a big change. So 20 years ago, mobile phones existed, but people didn't use them very much. People had computers, but they were often, there were laptops then, but people weren't attached to digital technology all the time. And now if you look around when you're outside or inside, most people, I would venture to say, are on a device at most times. It depends what you're doing, but if you're communicating with another person, a lot of the time that's in writing because it's less disruptive and it's less time sensitive than a phone call. You can't always talk to them, but you might be able to write something to them and message back and forth while you're doing something else. And when this first became popular, people exploded with excitement about how you could rewrite language. You no longer had to write things as they were spelt. So kids were writing school with an SK instead of SCH. Or, hey, you can write U and R, like are you happy, with a letter U and a letter R. And so it was this flurry of activity, and it really showed people's social identity as well. Hey, I'm new, hip and cool. See how I write CU-8-er.
Yeah.
And now if you ask young people or even older people about that, it's cringeworthy, it's embarrassing. The only time anyone would do that would be with irony. So it shows who we are and what time we're living in. It made communication fun. And for a lot of people who shied away from written communication because they weren't good spellers or weren't good at expressing themselves, it gave them a short, succinct and a medium where you didn't have to be correct to respond to someone. So and now it's fairly common not to use all these abbreviations anymore because the technology's changed. The screens are bigger. You don't have to do it with your thumbs, one button 3 times to get a certain letter. You don't have to pay per message anymore because people tend not to be on pay-as-you-go plans. And so people aren't really abbreviating anymore, but what they're doing are just leaving out capitals and punctuation and using a lot of emojis, for example, or lots of punctuation to show excitement, like lots of exclamation marks.
Yeah, that's true. I was going to ask about emojis as well. So further, how does the use of them in other forms of shorthand kind of affect the way that we communicate online, and how does it, let's chat about it in relation to kind of miscommunication, because I feel like with emojis or even just like shorthand texting, there's differences, I guess, across generations. Like often in our generation, like with full stops and things, that used to just be, where you'd finish a sentence. But now often it's kind of thought as like, oh, someone's angry with me or there's something wrong. And same with emojis. It seems that everyone kind of has their own language within using them. So how does that kind of affect our communication or miscommunication?
Yeah, when you don't have the person's face in front of you, there is so much room for ambiguity. And that's why we do use a lot of emojis in these digital messages. And the thing is, the English language or any language is so rich that in writing you actually should be able to express exactly what you mean. And if you've got a page and a pen or a quill or a typewriter, you've got the room to do that. But if you're exchanging short little messages, there's so much room for ambiguity that to save our 1,000 words or whatever, we put an emoji. And that can be saying, I mean this, or I'm being sarcastic, or sorry. So we add that in because you haven't got the whole facial expression and body language there to help. So you kind of add a fake face to add that. But these things change quickly. So my honours students have informed me that apparently now a normal smiley face is so old hat that it's almost sarcastic or passive aggressive, or like a fake smile. And so then you need to choose something that's more extreme. So you have to have a laughing face with also tears or rolling on its side. So if you actually want to say, no, I really do mean a smiling face, you have to choose something more extreme.
Yeah.
But that changes with generations, and so you might misunderstand what someone means.
Yeah.
And you also mentioned full stops. I have an honours student project going on this year looking at that, because there's 2 really well-cited studies that say that people found messages with a full stop at the end to be less sincere or more abrupt. And I know that people do feel that. But all their response messages that they used were 1 word long. And 1 word with a full stop at the end can have that aggressive kind of, or passive-aggressive look, or blunt or brusque look. But if you have a much longer message with a full stop at the end, we're looking at what happens if you lengthen the message. At what point does the rhetorical function of it, like, fine, when does that become, okay, fine, I'll see you at 7 just like we arranged, full stop?
Yeah.
Does that full stop get kind of mitigated, or is it less rude because there were so many words before it, they must have meant it for the grammatical end of sentence reason? So that's something that we'll be looking at.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'd be interested to hear the results of that. Yeah. So next big question. What role do you think that language technologies have in shaping the future of digital communication? So with things like ChatGPT, which is the big new thing at the moment, I think it's amazing and terrifying at the same time. But do you think that kind of spelling and articulation and sentence structure and things like that will ever die out because eventually we will just use technology to write stuff for us? Or do you think there'll always be a need for kind of understanding all of this?
I'm wary about saying it will be the ruin of us, because people have been saying that since the times of the Roman Empire. The printing press, the telephone, the television, everything will ruin everything else. I think as humans we just add and add and add until we've got all these layers. I would like to say it would help people write better, but I think we've got evidence. You know, we've all got access to spell checkers now. Whenever you have a red underline, if you're using Word, for example, you could right-click on it and choose the correct spelling and learn from that. Do people do that? No. It either corrects them without them thinking about it, without them being aware, or you just choose the right one and you don't think about it. You don't use it as a learning tool.
Yeah.
So I would like to think that AI tech generators such as ChatGPT or any other one, I'd like to think it might teach people how to write better, but I don't think people have the self-discipline to use it as a self-improvement tool. Instead, it's just like adding it on top of what you did and maybe losing some of your skills. So.
Yeah, okay. Well, I like the supposed optimism there.
Oh, I just think it's very easy at any one generation to say this will ruin everything.
Yeah.
But no. Well, what's ruination? Like, we no longer use thee, thou, and thy. Is that a problem? Like, we use words in a way that they used to not have that meaning. So nice used to mean silly, and fulsome, at least in my view, still means disgustingly, overblownly cloying, but now people use it to mean wholesome. So, and I say, that's not what it means, but language changes, everything changes, so we can't be too critical of the change, because we're all using the current version of what we think is right.
Yeah, exactly. We just change and adapt. Yeah. Cool. Thank you for answering all those questions.
That's okay.
I've just got one more. What is your favourite fact in general about psychology?
Oh, you did warn me that you'd ask me this one, so I've been thinking about it, and I was trying to think too broadly, but then I thought, no, my area is the language, also the psychology of language, and my particular interest is in literacy. And one fact that I learned at a conference quite a few years ago now, but it just really almost made everyone gasp, and it's about learning to read, and it's the percentage of your reading ability that's genetically determined. And I want to put a little bit of context at the end, which is, it's not like you should just give up or say, well, my child will be fine. But about 80% of your reading ability is determined by your genes. It's not about the environment. And so sometimes people tend to say, oh, well, my child's not going to be any good at reading, so that's what it is. But what it means is, if we already know that, or have a good suggestion, if you've got a family history of finding reading difficult, it just means earlier on, start helping your child more, put more effort into it. And if you're a good reader, then maybe you won't have a difficult journey, and for your child, it will actually be easier. But a lot. And I think that holds more generally. More and more of the skills that we used to think we taught our kids or ourselves, they're actually already predetermined, but that doesn't mean you can't strive to be better.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, cool. It's a great fact. Well, thank you again for coming on today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.